You're arguing with someone in the shower, but that argument happened 3 years ago. Or maybe it never happened at all. You lie down in bed, and your mind transports you to an entirely different scene. Perhaps a conversation, a confrontation, or a moment that may never take place. You craft the perfect sentences. You predict exactly what the other person will say. You deliver your rebuttal. Sometimes you win that argument. Sometimes you are simply understood, and that feels even better than winning. Or the opposite happens. You live through a catastrophe in advance. You imagine step by step how something that hasn't happened yet could go wrong. Every detail, every painful possibility, every conceivable bad ending. Sometimes those scenarios feel so vivid that when you wake up in the morning, your brain is as exhausted as if it actually happened. And perhaps you've thought, there's something wrong with me. Normal people don't do this. Stop. Because that thought itself is wrong. The fact that your mind works this way isn't a glitch. It is an evolutionarily encoded, psychologically significant, and profoundly human trait. But very few people know what it actually means. Very few understand where those scenarios come from, what purpose they serve, and why they feel so real. Let's talk about it. Your brain has a system called the default mode network, DMN. This system kicks in when you aren't focused on the outside world, on a task, a screen, or a conversation. And at that exact moment, this is where your brain is most active. Dreaming, processing the past, simulating the future, modeling the minds of others. All of this is the work of this network. Research shows that this network isn't activated in silence. It's activated when it's firing on all cylinders. In other words, when you're building scenarios in your head, your brain isn't idle. On the contrary, it's performing one of the most complex tasks it's capable of. Neuroscientists call this mental simulation. And this simulation is an evolutionary tool. Humanity survived because we could rehearse danger in our minds before actually experiencing it. We prepared for the real world by first living through social situations, conflicts, and losses internally. That scenario-building mind is an adaptation that has protected our species for thousands of years. The problem was never you. You carry a brain that works exceptionally well. But let's go deeper. Everyone builds scenarios from time to time, but some people experience this much more intensely, more frequently, and with a much greater sense of reality. And this difference is no coincidence. When you were a child, your environment was unpredictable, wasn't it? Perhaps there was a parent whose mood you could never guess. Perhaps there was an environment where you had to be constantly on guard. You learned to read the vibe when you entered a room, the subtle expression on a face, or what a certain silence meant. Like a little detective, you gathered clues. You calculated possible scenarios in advance. Being prepared kept you safe. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, a perceptual system that has become hypersensitive to threat or uncertainty. This system develops in children who grow up in insecure or unpredictable environments. It's not a bad thing. It was a perfect adaptation for that time. Your mind protected you. By living through possibilities in advance, it numbed the pain of surprises. But that child grew up. And the system is still running, even if there's no longer a danger, even if you no longer have to walk into that room. And there's this, and perhaps you'll see this clearly for the first time. The scenarios you build in your head usually fall into two categories, and both are the voice of a different need. The first category, scenarios where you say what you couldn't say. You relive that perfect comeback, that timely confrontation, or that moment where you are finally understood. Do you know what this means? You want to be seen. You want to be heard. And in real life, that moment of being seen either never came too late, or came from the wrong person. That scenario is the imaginative surrogate for a rejected need. The second category: scenarios where you live through catastrophe in advance. You visualize the worst versions of things that haven't happened yet over and over. This isn't torture, it's the voice of a nervous system saying, if I experience this now, it won't hurt as much when it happens for real. Psychologists call this proactive coping, simulating pain to prepare for pain. This too is a survival strategy, and once upon a time it truly protected you. But we must also realize these scenarios sometimes don't help. Sometimes they imprison. When you replay a past argument in your mind dozens of times, that argument doesn't close. Instead, it grows stronger with every repetition, because the brain cannot fully distinguish between reality and imagination. Cortisol, the stress hormone, is released both in the face of a real threat and a simulated threat in your mind. So, while you're living through that non-existent argument, your brain is living it for real. It's getting tired for real. It's hurting for real. And you wake up in the morning, and from the outside, nothing happened. But from the inside, you feel like you've just come back from a war. High empathy is also part of this picture. People who build intense scenarios in their heads usually have an extraordinary capacity for empathy. They can visualize what others will feel, think, and how they will react so vividly that it almost feels like telepathy. Before a conversation even happens, you can already imagine the other person's facial expression, their tone of voice, and that subtle hint of disappointment. This is a burden, but it is also a gift, because this capacity makes you an extraordinary observer. You see the nuances, the layers, and the unsaid elements of human relationships. You read the texture of the air when you enter a room. You notice things others don't. This is a depth that many people do not possess. The problem isn't the depth itself. The problem is that this depth sometimes consumes you, and no one ever taught you how to live with it. Perhaps you're thinking, so how do I stop this? And I understand that question. But perhaps the question that needs to be asked first is this: are you trying to stop it, or are you trying to understand it? Because trying to silence the scenarios in your mind by fighting them usually just makes them stronger. The brain becomes more interested in what is being suppressed. Research has shown this repeatedly. Telling yourself, stop building scenarios right now, is about as effective as telling your brain, don't think of a pink elephant. But looking at those scenarios with curiosity, asking, what is this mind trying to tell me right now? Which need is it expressing? Which wound is it pointing to? Opens a different door. And behind that door, there is usually something that has been waiting to be seen for a very long time. You aren't weird. You aren't too much. You cannot be reduced to the label of an overthinker. You are someone who has learned to turn their mind into a rehearsal space to understand how the world works, to be safe, to be seen, and to be prepared for pain. That mind protected you. It still does, but you don't have to only be protected anymore. You can now live not inside those scenarios, but with them, by recognizing them, understanding them, and listening to them with compassion. There is magic in the ordinary, and sometimes that magic reveals itself unexpectedly. Right in the middle of those dreams, you show no one, in the quietest corners of your mind. When that moment comes, recognize it.